Welcome, everyone, to the Flower Files podcast sponsored by Wildly Native Flower Farm. Here, everyone is welcome to talk with fellow flower lovers, including real perspectives from the farm, the flowers, and me, the florist.
From the messy day-to-day operations down to the details and even business perspectives, this podcast has a little bit of everything to keep it real. We know that life can get crazy and we don't always have the time to spend on what we love, so we are here to help you take a little time to indulge in nature. I'm Liza Getz.
I'm Lizzie Frey, and we are the team that makes this podcast. Every once in a while, we have a couple guests, this business thing, and what we are working with is called life.
Join us as we walk you through how to think outside the box, talk from the farmer's perspective, have honest conversations about florals, and how to run, well, life. So listen in.
You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, in the podcast section, and any of your other podcast platforms. You can also find us online at wildlynativeflowerfarm.com, and in an easy way, you can look in the show notes, and all of the information will be right there for easy access.
Hey friends, welcome back to the Flower Files, where we grow better flowers, help you build smarter systems, and live a little happier with dirt under our nails. That might be my favorite manicure. So today's episode is one I wish someone had kind of shared with me or given me when I first started growing flowers. A couple years ago, I was first starting out and I lost some blooms. And because I lost some blooms, it meant that I had lost some money. And it definitely made me feel like I had lost some confidence. And it wasn't because of the weather, and it wasn't because of bad seed, and it wasn't because I wasn't cut out for this. It was because I hadn't managed my soil correctly. I had actually fallen into the trap of believing some of those soil myths. It's that quiet, common, well-meaning advice that sounds about right, but in reality, it actually costs you some stems. And if you're a gardener or a beginner flower farmer, and it doesn't matter what kind of gardener you are, this episode might completely change the way you look at growing flowers and growing anything in your beds this season. We are talking about soil myths today. And we're talking about those myths because they actually cost you blooms. So let's get into it. All right, so talking about soil, there is a hidden cost of soil confusion. So before we start busting those myths, let's zoom out just a little bit, because when blooms are disappointing, what do most growers do? We immediately try to figure out what's going on, and we blame maybe the wrong variety. Maybe we had the wrong kind of seed. So maybe we say, oh, the seed company didn't grow well for me. Those seeds didn't grow well for me. Maybe we look and say, oh, the weather. It's always the weather. I feel like farmers are always talking about the weather. Maybe it's the timing. Maybe we planted late. Maybe it's the deer, the raccoon, the neighbor's cat. Who knows? It could even be the cycle of the moon. But very rarely do people sit back and say, let's look at the soil. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The bloom isn't just the final expression of everything that's happening underground. If your soil is out of balance, your blooms are going to show everything that happened all along the way. Your flowers are going to actually talk to you. No, I'm not saying that they whisper in your ear, but if you have short stems, if you have small blooms, if you have delayed flowering, if you have disease issues, if you have excess foliage, if you have weak vase life, any of those things can cause your blooms to be disappointing. And when any of that happens, we start below the ground. So let's talk about some of those myths and where they start. A lot of the times people think, well, more fertilizer means more flowers. And that's probably the most expensive myth. More fertilizer equals more blooms, right? It feels logical. You want extra production. I'll add a little extra fertilizer. Feed the plant, give it an extra boost. But here's what actually happens. Fertilizers, especially those with a high nitrogen content, push more vegetative growth. So you have more leaves. You have this really lush, vegetative, leafy green plant that's probably really, really high and really, really full. And it looks like this lush green drama queen. And if you've ever grown zinnias or cosmos that were super tall and they looked amazing, and all of a sudden you're looking at them going, where's all the flowers? Then you definitely know that it was something below the ground. If they're barely blooming, you've seen this in action. Nitrogen tells the plant, grow, compete, build foliage. But blooming is reproduction. And that's a whole different message. Reproduction requires balance. So if your nitrogen is high and your phosphorus and potassium are imbalanced, the plant stays in vegetative mode. It doesn't get the signal to go to the reproductive mode. So this means you get gorgeous leaves, but we're not growing plants or your flowers for their leaves. You can end up with some floppy stems as well, and that is a big issue in any type of vase use or bouquet. Fewer flowers, and then you look at the plant and you go, well, it probably needs more fertilizer. So maybe you add a little more, you side dress a little bit, and you add a little extra, and the cycle just continues. So the one year, I had a year where my celosia were stunning. It was the plume variety, absolutely amazing. Huge plants, literally grew over my head. They were close to 6 feet tall, deep green, looked so healthy and lush. They grew above all of the supports that we had set in the field. But I kept waiting and I was like, okay, where are the flowers? I adjusted the irrigation. I thought, well, maybe they're just too dry. And I just kept assuming something was deficient. The truth, I should have been doing soil testing, because I would have learned much sooner, much quicker, that I had overfed the nitrogen in the early part of the season. And I paid for it in the blooms. Tallest celosia I've ever grown, but definitely not the best harvest that I've ever had. So, real quick diagnostic here. If your plants are really leafy, super dark green, and growing fast, be prepared, because they might not be blooming in the way that you want them to. You could have nitrogen dominance. So the solution isn't more fertilizer, it's balance in your fertilizer. And that's really important. It has to be balanced the whole way around. Okay, myth number 2. Compost fixes everything. Listen, you guys know by now I love compost. You love compost. Everybody loves compost. But compost is not magical fairy dust in the garden. It's just not. If your soil drains poorly, if your soil is showing other signs of stress, if it's compacted, if it has, for instance, maybe an extreme pH, or you've got a phosphorus overload, any of those things are going to have an issue. The compost alone won't fix it. And here's something that many just general gardeners, not cut flower folks, but gardeners may not realize. Excess compost over multiple years can actually create a nutrient imbalance. Yeah, so all that good stuff that everybody wants to sprinkle like pixie dust, you got to watch, because especially your phosphorus content, flower growers often add compost annually without testing. Over time, that phosphorus builds up, and excess phosphorus can be an issue. It can lock out your micronutrients. Your micronutrients, of course, the first one that always comes to mind for me is calcium, and that's really important if you're a vegetable grower, in your bloom set on the end of your vegetables, but in flowers that reduces root efficiency. It decreases your overall bloom performance. So more organic matter is not always better. Balanced organic matter is better. You want to make sure that you're using your compost correctly. You want to make sure that you understand these compost truths, because it improves your structure over time. It improves your overall microbial life, and it definitely helps your water retention in those sandy soils that are incredibly porous. If you add it in gradually, it can improve the drainage in a really heavy clay situation, but it does not instantly fix compaction. Compaction is when it's really, really stuck together. And compost isn't going to correct your pH. That's a chemical issue. And it's absolutely not going to replace any of your mineral deficiencies. Compost is support. It's not an overall cure. So myth number 3, if it's in a bag, it's good soil. Friends, let's talk about the bag aisle. You go to the bag aisle and you look at the soil. You've got topsoil, garden soil, premium blend, fertilizer in, fertilizer out. Many inexpensive bag soils are mostly, a lot of them are partially decomposition. It's broken down wood fibers. So there's pieces of bark, you've got some fill material, and as those materials break down, they themselves can tie up some nitrogen, which means your plant may look hungry, but even if you fertilize, it still may look hungry. So this is why seedlings planted into mixes or things that are listed as garden soil often don't do well. You need to read your ingredient lists, because just like on a recipe or anything else that you would add something to, you have to have the correct ratios, and you want to use your soil for the correct use. You want to look for compost included, and you want to look for aged forest products. You don't want large bark materials. You also want to look for some perlite or drainage material, because that's really going to help that soil have the balance that it wants. Because you don't want that heavy, muddy topsoil for containers. You're not going to have the correct drainage. Your seed starting mixes are different for a reason. They have a finer texture. Think about everything has to pop out through that stuff. You don't want large bark chunks. You want to have something that's specifically designed for germination, because one soil does not fit all of the uses. You need to check your ingredient list. Okay. So myth number 4, if it's struggling, water it. I think the number one question that we get asked is, how do I water my plant? I think this myth, if the plant isn't doing well, add water. When leaves wilt, we water. But wilted leaves can mean dry soil, or they can mean saturated soil with oxygen lost. They could be drowning, because your roots need oxygen. If that soil stays compacted and wet, your roots suffocate, and suffocated roots cannot absorb nutrients. They're not alive anymore. They can't breathe. So nutrient deficiency symptoms start to appear. You water more and it gets worse. So maybe you try to add some fertilizer and it gets even worse. So quick at-home soil drainage test. Really simple. You're going to dig a hole about the width and depth of a shovel. Fill it with water. Watch it. I know it sounds exciting, but let it drain. Fill it again. If the water remains after 4 to 6 hours, you have drainage issues. So the solution isn't more water, it's improving the structure so that the plants can function correctly inside the soil. You want to make sure you're watering correctly. And to water correctly, you have to understand your soil. Again, it all leads back to the soil. Myth number 5. My soil's fine. I've always grown here. Believe it or not, soil changes. Crops remove nutrients, Rain leaches minerals. Amendments shift chemistry. Year 1 might be amazing. Year 2, a little bit different. Year 3, half the field does great, the other half doesn't do well. Without testing, you are guessing, and guessing is expensive. So a basic soil test tells you the chemistry of your soil. It doesn't break down the physical properties, but it will tell you the chemical properties. Things like pH, your phosphorus amount, your potassium amount, your nitrogen amount. It will also break down some of your organic matter percentages, and all of these will help give you direction. It's not guesswork. It's not something that you're like, oh, it grew fine last year. pH matters for blooms because even if nutrients are present, if your pH is off, your plants can't access them. And most cut flowers prefer a slightly acidic to a neutral soil. So roughly a 6 to a 6.8 soil. As soon as your pH starts to drift, your nutrient lockout starts to happen. So you may have those nutrients in the soil, but the plant can't access them. It's kind of like being locked in a room with a great big window and saying, look, it's over there, and you can't get to it. So what does this show up as? It can show up as pale leaves, which again could also be water issues. So you really need to understand your soil. Weak stems, it can show up as weak stems again. It can show up as poor flowering as well. And without balance, adding fertilizer literally does nothing. It does nothing. So, myth number 6, I've grown here for years, so leads to, well, we'll till it this year. Tilling fixes hard soil. Tilling temporarily loosens the soil, but long term, repeated tilling can break your fungal networks. Your soil is a living system. If you till and till and till, it can destroy that soil aggregate. It can help increase compaction after rain, which is definitely not something you want. Healthy soil is structured. It's biologically active. So instead of constantly tilling, add your organic matter strategically. You want to make sure all of those pieces make sense and they're working together in the soil because you want all those little microbes working together to support your plants. Use your cover crops. Reduce your traffic in your beds. It's amazing when we pull our fabric back where we've walked that entire season. Wow, is that compacted. So you really want to protect your soil surface. Soil is like an ecosystem. I know I said it, but it's not a construction site. Myth number 7, small blooms mean I picked a bad variety. Okay, sometimes yes, maybe we picked the wrong variety in the catalog because it was all in Latin and you thought it was right. But it could be from a potassium deficiency, overcrowding because you accidentally planted them too tight, a general nutrient imbalance. It could be compaction that is then limiting your root expansion. Your bloom size is that final performance, but the roots determine the show. They're the ones who are working behind the scenes. So what does balanced soil actually look like? I'm going to paint you a picture. Maybe a muddy picture, okay? So balanced soil drains within hours. You do that shovel test and your soil drains literally within hours. You don't want it within minutes because then it's too quick. You want it to hold moisture, but you don't want it to be soggy. You don't want a bog, unless you're growing bog plants. But you want it to crumble in your hand. You want it to just kind of crumble apart. You want it to smell really good. You want it to smell like earth. You want it to have that so that it produces steady growth. This in turn will create predictable harvest windows for you, which is really important. And it doesn't matter whether you're growing flowers or vegetables. Don't panic. You don't chase those deficiencies weekly and you don't overcorrect. Balanced soil creates calm growers. And there's enough stress in trying to grow things. You don't need to stress about your soil. There's definitely an emotional side of soil because There's a whole side of it that no one talks about. Soil confusion can create a little insecurity, and maybe you feel a little silly asking some of those questions. So you start to doubt yourself, or maybe you compare yourself to other growers, or you assume I'm missing something. I don't understand. I don't know who to talk to. So maybe you Google. And then how do you get that information and get it clarified? So realistically, you just need a little clarity. You need to understand all of those pieces because that clarity builds confidence. So, not to sound like a commercial by any means, but this is exactly why I built our soil course. It's not to overwhelm you with chemistry. It's not to make you feel confused. It's to teach you how to read a soil test. Everybody says, okay, I'm going to amend my soil after I get my soil test. What is that? Like, how does that work? What do all these numbers mean? When do I actually use the compost? What's gypsum? How do I lime? And I don't mean lemons and limes. It's very different. Okay, I've got compaction. How do I improve my drainage? What do I actually do? What do I do if I think I'm overfeeding? I designed this so you can stop guessing and start growing intentionally. A soil can be confusing because there's so many, literally, layers to it. If this episode made you rethink what's happening underground, good. That was my goal. Because blooms don't start in the greenhouse. They start in the soil. They start with what nobody really wants to talk about. They start with the dirt. And we've got to do the dirty work. If you love this episode, share it with a gardening friend who keeps blaming the seed packet. And I'll see you next week on the Flower Files.